When I first started, I would often overlook the settings of my needle tip. Sometimes I would have my needle tip out way too much, sometimes I would have it out not enough. From my experience, there is 110% a sweet spot when it comes to setting out our needle depth settings. When I first started, there was a misconception that I had when it came to hanging out my needle. I thought that as far as I would hang out my needle is as far as it's going to be going into the skin. So therefore I would adjust my needle to the depth of what I thought the skin was. This is exactly what we do not want to do. It's very important to note that we do not set up our needle depth settings to correspond to the depth of the skin that we think we'll be tattooing. That's not how we want to approach it. When we are setting up the settings on our needle, we want to set it up in a manner that's going to give us optimal ink flow, so that way we get a continuous cycle of ink. Not only continuous, we get a consistent cycle of ink. The reason why we don't really focus too much on a length of a needle is because we are only going to be working off the very tips of the needle. It doesn't really matter which location of a body we will be tattooing. I know that may not fully make sense to some of us, however, this is where that misconception comes into play. Oftentimes when I would set my needle depth settings, I would kind of gauge a thickness of skin, whether it was fake skin and or human skin, and then I would set my needle depth settings to whatever I was tattooing. And once again, this is exactly how we do not want to approach it. I'm 110% aware that this may not fully make sense to a lot of us, but please bear with me. Stay with me until the end of this video. I assure you it'll all kind of click. Here is a great example of what I am trying to say. This machine is pushing out this needle right here, and you can see it's about 4.2 millimeters. So this is about a 4.2 millimeter stroke right here. What I am saying is that we are not going to use 4.2 millimeters to deposit ink into the skin. This is going to be shredding the skin. This is going to be scarring. This is probably close to torture if the needle is going into the skin this much. Here's a better example to get my points across. So right here I have a piece of real skin, fake skin, and in comparison to the 4.2 millimeter stroke, you could see that the needle would essentially stab through the skin and then penetrate all the way through down to the hypodermis. This would be scarring, bleeding, just overall torture in my opinion if we are depositing ink with the entire needle of a 4.2 millimeter stroke. Per this example. Going back to, as I mentioned a little while ago, we are only going to want to work off the very tips of our needles. So even if the needle was set this far out, it doesn't mean that we're going to be using the entire needle to deposit ink into the skin. We're only going to be using just the very tip, so that way we can hit the dermis layer of the skin, so that way we deposit ink into the correct layer of the skin, so that way it lives indefinitely with clean, consistent, smooth healing results. Understanding that we will be working off just the very tips of our needles will give us a better way to approach the overall application. When I set up my needle depth, I rarely ever set it up to compensate for whatever part of the skin that I will be tattooing, whether it's fake or human. When I set up my needle, I set it up in correspondence to having a certain hang. I like my needle to hang out the tip, so that way I can work off of the tip of the needle. So I like my needle to hang out off of this tip right here, so that way I can use this tip up here to apply the tattoo. Not everyone feels comfortable with this approach, as it is something that we have to work into, but I would recommend starting off with this approach as opposed to writing the tube. It's very important to note that I do not set up my needle tip to compensate for any sort of depth that I think exists. What that means is if I'm going to be tattooing an elbow, a hand right here on the palm, bottom of a foot, top of a finger, behind the ear, it does not matter. I am going to set up my settings the exact same way for each and every tattoo, even if I am tattooing fake skin. The reason for that is because, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be working off just the very tip of my needle. I will not be introducing this entire needle into any skin at all. It's just going to be the very tip. What I am focused on when I am setting up my needle settings are clarity and ink flow. I need to be able to see my needle tip at all times when I am applying ink to skin. Not only that, I need to have clean, consistent, adequate ink flow to provide me with a smooth workflow. I can have all of my technicalities correct and all of my basic fundamentals aligned. If I don't have adequate ink flow, my lines or my work, let alone, is not going to come out clean or consistent. What this means is that I cannot set out my needle too far and I can't set it too low. Some adversities from this is if I set out my needle too far, for example, I'm not going to have adequate ink flow. The needle isn't cycling back into the cartridge all the way, so when it cycles back in, it only goes a certain amount and then it goes back out, which means that there's no ink coming into the needle again. It's just the tip of the needle is going to be hanging out all the time, which means that the needle is not going to be picking up newer ink that's within the cartridge. That's basically an adversity from hanging out our needle way too far, is inadequate ink flow. When we don't hang out our needle enough, for example, something maybe like this, here we start experiencing a bunch of different adversities. So this right here would be considered riding the tube. When we are creating lines, this plastic tubing is going to be rubbing on the skin. Some beginners tend to do this to play it more safe, but this is a really bad habit to pick up, and I don't recommend anyone going to riding the tube. We should always learn how to float the needle and use just the very tips as I've mentioned here. So some adversities that we may experience when not hanging out our needle far enough is pulling, extreme pulling when we are creating lines or applying any sort of work really. We're not going to be able to see our work due to the pulling. Not only that, we're not going to be able to tell which line is which, because when we are lining with a needle depth like this, the plastic tube is definitely going to be rubbing the skin, so it's going to look like there's two lines happening at once, which is something that's very confusing and which I guess shouldn't happen within any tattooing workflow unless it's intentful and it's supposed to be that way. This is very important that we find that healthy medium. It's going to get to the point where when we find out that healthy medium where our needle depth settings work best for us, we're going to be able to eyeball it, but we have to kind of go through the mistakes, see the results from not enough needle to too much needle, so that way we can find the perfect amount of needle that we need. Every setup is going to be different. However, the same rule of thumb would still apply. If you're using a coil and you find that your machine isn't bringing out ink, but there is ink in your cartridge, you're probably hanging out your needle way too much. If you're using a coil and you find that every time you create a line it gets really messy and pulley, you're probably not hanging out your needle far enough. When we take time and focus on these settings and find an appropriate setting, then we're going to give the needle enough space to not only cycle back into the tube, but we're also going to give the needle enough space from the tip tube right here to provide us with that clarity, so that way we can stay seeing our needle point as much as possible. Now, one thing that I'm not going to do is I'm not going to tell you a good needle depth to use around here, because I don't want to mislead anyone. It could be different for everyone. Some people would feel comfortable having their needle out right around here and then getting clean work. Some people would feel comfortable hanging out a little bit more and still getting clean work. So although I'm not going to tell you a one concrete setting to use, what I would recommend using is a medium. So where I'm going to start for this demonstration is somewhere around here. If I notice any adversities, I'm going to go from there, and I would recommend you do the same. Try to start at a medium. Don't start with the needle too far hanging out. Don't start with it too far in. If I had to give a good place to start, you can eyeball it. Start around here. This is about 3.5 millimeters right here. We could see that the needle, well, maybe not with our eye, but this is not too far. The needle should still be cycling all the way back in. And on top of that, we have the needle hanging out far enough to give us clarity and to avoid any sort of pulling when we are creating lines. Pulling isn't 110% avoidable. However, we can go about minimizing it, and hanging out my needle just a little bit more is one of those ways that I can go about minimizing pulling within my tattooing workflow. A good way to tell if your needle is cycling back into your tube is to turn your machine off, and you can see that the needle stops, and it does in fact retract all the way back into the tube. So what that tells me is when the needle comes back in, it's going to be bringing fresh ink out, giving me a clean, consistent cycle of ink, as long as I have enough in my tip tube to do whatever it is that I need to do. Here is a good example of not hanging out my needle far enough. You can see that if I were to deposit ink with this setting right here, you can see that the tip of my needle tube is already rubbing on the skin, and that's exactly what we don't want. We don't want to be riding the tube like that. This is a very good demonstration or visual representation of what it is to not hang out our needle far enough. This is what it looks like to have a more healthier needle depth setting, while this is just hanging out the needle way too far. So you can see that they all have visual differences. A direct result of not hanging out our needle far enough would look something like this. So instantly I get pulling and a mess. On top of that, I can see two lines. Now I didn't fill my cartridge up all the way so that way I could avoid pulling as much as possible. But if I fill it up even more, we will see that the pulling comes out even more. So even when I try to control the pulling, I'm still getting that with this sort of needle depth. On top of that, I'm getting a mess and I can't tell which line is which because I am riding the tube. So it looks as though there's two lines here that I am tattooing. So these are a couple of unwanted adversities. On top of that, I have to try much harder to get the needle into the skin just because there's not enough needle that I can work off the tip from. So what I'm doing is I find myself compensating for not being able to use a tip. I find myself driving it more into the skin, and you can see how it's kind of getting a sort of bruised appearance right here from the pressure that I am applying with this needle depth. So in many ways, this needle depth just feels wrong to me. It doesn't feel natural, and I don't recommend any beginner ever riding the tube or approaching it like this. And 9 times out of 10, when we just start, we really fill our ink cartridges up all the way to the top just because we think that we have to do that. So you can see right here that there's no clear sign of the needle tip. Everything kind of blurs together and it all just bleeds. So for many reasons, we do not want to set out our needle depth not enough. We don't want to set it too low for these inadequacies right here. This right here is exactly where I prefer to hang my needle out to. This right here feels natural and comfortable to me. This also enables me to work off just the very tip of my needle, giving me an optimal workflow. I'm also able to keep an eye on my needle point throughout the entire application. So for these reasons, this right here is my sweet spot. If I stop the machine, you're gonna notice that the machine does go all the way back into the needle cartridge. So that's a clear sign that I have a good depth going here when my needle retracts all the way, but I'm still getting enough hang to see the tip of my needle for that clarity that I mentioned earlier. So if I go here, I'm gonna go ahead and kind of just taper in, and you're gonna notice that the tip doesn't touch the skin. I'm also able to see my line throughout the entire process. And that right there for me as an artist is very, very, very important. That right there provides me with a very clean and smooth workflow. You're also going to notice too that I don't really have that natural need to drive my needle into the skin. I more so just let the needle make enough rounds and I work off just the very tip of my needle to deposit the ink in the most clean and consistent manner that I can deposit the ink into the skin. Here's one more demonstration of a smooth workflow. Even with the skin bouncing around, I'm still able to see my needle tip clearly. I'm still able to deposit the ink in a clean, consistent, solid, saturated manner. And you can see that not once, even with the skin bouncing all over the place, does the skin touch the tip of my tube. So that right there, I feel, is the sweet spot for me. This right here is what it looks like to hang out our needle just way too far. This is obnoxious right here in my opinion. Although some artists may prefer something like this, me, I just don't. This is not really something I feel comfortable with for many reasons. Now you're gonna notice that I just filled up my ink tube here, so there's gonna be ink. However, after a certain point, I'm going to get inadequate ink flow just because the needle isn't going to be retracting back into the skin the way that I need it to be. Here's an obnoxious setting. So this is just hanging out way too far. I don't really feel like this is necessary. Although some may prefer this, me, it's just not my preference. If I go ahead and try to approach it the way I normally would, I may be experiencing some sort of inadequacies from maybe inaccurate ink deposits, meaning like inaccurate lines. I'm not going to get any sort of consistency because I don't feel like I'm going to get consistent ink flow. So placing this down, it took a little bit for the ink to come out and carry out to the tip of the needle. So I would imagine at this pace, if I keep going, I'm definitely going to be experiencing inadequate ink flow. The only reason why I'm not experiencing this right now is because I just drenched my needle cartridge before this demonstration to ensure that I did have ink flow. Not only that, what I'm also noticing is the needle is also snagging quite a bit because the skin is bouncing around, so the length of the needle is getting caught in the skin, I'm assuming there. Which you're going to see that now those ink deposits are really starting to show up. You can see right here, that was a good example. You can see the needle is struggling to keep a consistent ink flow coming out because of how far it's hanging out. It's just not retracting far enough back into the machine. So if I maybe turn it off, turn it back on, you can see it got a little refresher there, so it started drawing ink back because the needle retracted as far back in as it could when I turned it off. And it started pushing a little bit more. But you can see this right here is a perfect example of ink struggles right here. This is hanging out a needle way too far. Nothing is coming out clean or consistent. I'm experiencing a lot of snags as well. So in my preference, this is why I do not prefer to hang out my needle this far. So as I've mentioned, believe it or not, there is a sweet spot in which you will have to put in a little bit of work to find what that sweet spot is for you. Mess with different settings and find what feels most natural and comfortable to you as the artist. That will be it for this video. Should you have any questions at all, I encourage you to drop a comment down below. I'll do my best to assist in the best possible direction. Before you go, please don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel and ring that bell for me, as I will be bringing more videos like this for you all. I do also have social medias under the same name as my YouTube. I have Facebook, Instagram, X, and TikTok, all under Daniel Yuck. I would appreciate the support over there as well. With that being said, I appreciate you, your time, and your support. Thank you very much. You have a great day.